Good morning, American History 2 students. This is American History 2, week 33. I'm so sorry about the fact that we didn't have class yesterday as scheduled. Unfortunately, Sunday evening, when I was trying to export my PowerPoint into a video for presentation purposes for you to watch, something happened and it wouldn't export. And then when I tried to save the presentation as a regular PowerPoint slideshow, not as a video, so I could maybe see if I could fix any of the issues that were causing it not to export, PowerPoint crashed and lost all my hours of work. So I had to redo everything yesterday. So this week we're discussing FDR's second term as president, the Hindenburg disaster, the War of the Worlds situation, and the start and first year of World War II. And your questions that I need you to answer today are, where was the first place that Hitler invaded? And I think we covered this briefly on last week's lesson. I almost said podcast. And so that's the first one. Where was the first place that Hitler invaded or went into or took over control of? Whatever you want to say. And then the second question is, who else was allied with Hitler during World War II? And I don't expect you to necessarily know that because I don't think we covered that last week. But I just wanted to see what you would present as the answer. And you know what? I'm going to throw in a bonus question too. What ended up pulling us out of the Great Depression? I think you'll have no trouble with that one. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go on to the next slide of our lesson. FDR Roosevelt's second term as president, part 1. FDR's second term is filled with conflict between himself and the Supreme Court. If you remember from last week, we did kind of touch on that. There were already some tensions between him and the Supreme Court during his first term. Those tensions are just going to kind of continue. Although the worst of FDR being mad at the Supreme Court was going to be mostly at the end of his first term, the beginning here of the second term. FDR also has to deal with the depression that is still gripping the world, except for Germany, who's come out of it, and we all know why from last week. And Italy's starting to come out of it as well with Mussolini. And we're seeing the rising conflict in Europe, and that's also going to put a strain on FDR as he's going to do his best to try to keep the U.S. out of the war, as that was what he ran his campaign on, is that he would get people back to where they were supposed to be, and he would also keep the U.S. out of the war. Obviously, that's only going to work for so long with the conflict that we were seeing come out of Europe. Okay, so February 5th, 1937, emboldened by his sweeping electoral victory, FDR sends his court packing scheme to Congress. So this was a bill calling for the reorganization of the federal judiciary system. It was allegedly to make the system more efficient at all its levels. But we all know the real reason. FDR was mad because the Supreme Court wasn't supporting everything FDR was doing to try to bring the U.S. out of the economic depression they were in. So the bill called for adding as many as 6 justices to the Supreme Court, should any of the current members over the age of 70 refuse to retire. It's just convenient that most of the people who didn't agree with his programs were over the age of 70. Within a month, Congress will pass the Supreme Court Retirement Act as a compromise, which it permits the Supreme Court Retirement Act permits justices to retire at 70 with full pay. But this does not lead, neither thing, obviously, well, FDR's bill didn't pass, but the one that does go through does not lead to any immediate resignations, and FDR is going to take a lot of criticism for doing that. The chairman of the board of USS Steel is going to recognize the United Steelworkers Union as a legitimate bargaining authority for its workforce. So, that's good. And that was on March 1st, 1937. On March 26, 1937, William H. Hastie becomes the first black federal judge. March 29th, 1937, we have the Coast Hotel versus Parrish Supreme Court case. Now, this case is going to overturn the ruling from the 1923 case, Atkins versus Children's Hospital. The Coast Hotel versus Parrish upholds the constitutionality of minimum wage laws for women. So the Supreme Court is basically saying that it's constitutional for women to get minimum wage. And this decision was actually, it's going to be the starting of some smoothing of tensions between FDR and the Supreme Court to a certain extent, because this supporting of the constitutionality of minimum wage laws is something that FDR wanted. April 12th, 1937, by a narrow 5-4 majority, the Supreme Court finds the National Labor Reactions Act to be constitutional, along with the decision the following month, which upholds the legality of the Social Security Act. Also, the Social Security Act is also seen as constitutional by by the Supreme Court. Sorry. These rulings helped to, again, smooth over some of the issues between FDR and the Supreme Court. And then May 1st, 1937, FDR signs the Third Neutrality Act, extending for another year the prohibitions against exporting arms and munitions to belligerents. Unlike the previous act, this one also requires belligerents to pay with cash for certain non-military goods purchased in the United States and to provide for transport in their own ships, giving the act its name, the Cash and Carry Law. So this is known as the Cash and Carry Law. So if any country in a war or a conflict of any kind, wanted anything from the U.S., they couldn't get arms from the U.S. And if they wanted other goods from the U.S., they had to pay with cash and provide transport. Like, the U.S. wasn't going to bring the goods to them. And this is just another attempt at FDR to keep the U.S. out of the rising conflict in Europe. And then May 6th, 1937, the German dirigible, I don't know why, the Hindenburg explodes. And the Hindenburg was a Zeppelin. If you don't know what a Zeppelin is, you're going to learn about it in a little bit later when we go into more detail about the Hindenburg explosion. And that was in Lakehurst, New Jersey, and 36 are going to die from that, unfortunately. July 2nd, 1937, world-famous American aviator Amelia Earhart vanishes. Amelia Earhart. So she, over the Pacific Ocean. None of her things have ever been recovered. Her plane hasn't ever been recovered. And it's like she literally just went poof and vanished into thin air. July 22nd, 1937, Congress passes the Bankhead Jones Farm Tenancy Act, which establishes the Farm Securities Administration, which provides low-interest loans for struggling farmers. August 12th, 1937, FDR appoints liberal Hugo L. Black of Alabama to the Supreme Court. September 2nd, 1937, Congress passes the National Housing Act. This bill establishes the U.S. Housing Authority, which is charged with administering loans for rural and urban home construction. December 11th, 1937, international relations continue to sour as Italy withdraws from the League of Nations following a little bit of criticism towards its invasion of Ethiopia. We're going to discuss that in further detail further on down the lesson. December 12th, 1937, the Japanese Air Force attacks the U.S. gunboat Panay in China's Yangtze River. Even though FDR was still withholding neutrality, was saying we were not involved in this, they still attack our gunboat. Japan does apologize kind of half-heartedly for the incident 2 days later. January 3rd, 1938, in his State of the Union address, FDR focuses on the nation's continuing economic and social problems, and also cites the necessity to be adequately strong in self-defense. So basically, he's kind of starting to see the writing on the wall of what's going to be going down here with the conflict in Europe, but he's still kind of digging his head in the sand and doesn't want to acknowledge it, thinks that maybe he can keep the U.S. out of the war, maybe, but obviously that's going to be unsuccessful. And then in February of 16th, 1938, FDR signs the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act as a part of, again, trying to stabilize the economy and help farmers out who were really suffering. And that act establishes the Federal Crop Insurance Corp, which is an agency which will accept wheat as payment for crop insurance taken out against the same crop. So you can give wheat as an insurance of the fact that you're going to pay money that you've taken out as a loan for wheat. Okay, then March 13th, 1938, German troops move into Austria and basically take over the country. March 18th, 1938, Mexico nationalizes all oil properties of the United States and other foreign-owned companies. April 26th, 1938, the House of Representatives forms a committee to investigate un-American activities headed by Martin Diaz of Texas. So its purpose is to investigate all groups, both the right and the left of the political spectrum, deemed un-American. So all group activities on both right and left, both Democrat and Republican, that are seen as being un-American in some way. May 27th, 1938, over FDR's veto, Congress passes the Revenue Act of 1938, reducing corporate income taxes to the purpose of stimulating the economy. And then June 22nd, 1938, Congress continues to enact several policies. This is just June, actually, of 1938. Congress is going to put in several acts. First, it has the Chandler Act, which amended the 1898, Federal Bankruptcy Act, which just put more procedures by which persons or businesses can avoid liquidation and settle their debts without declaring bankruptcy, basically. And then we had the Civil Aeronautics Act, which airplanes were growing at this time, and so this act kind of regulates things and makes things safer for passengers on airplanes. The Food and Drug Cosmetic Act provides stricter regulations of the food, drugs, and cosmetics of the U.S., meaning that they had to be ingredient disclosure, they had to tell what was in them, and any misbranding and false advertising is bad and will be punishable. Okay, and then in June 25th, 1938, FDR signs the Fair Labor Standards Act, which raised the minimum wage and set the maximum work week at 40 hours. Okay, but here's the thing. So let's talk about, obviously the setting a maximum work week, like how many hours a person can work maximum for a week, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And this didn't really apply necessarily to small businesses. It was more for large corporations. If you or your parents or anyone you know owns their own business or works for a small business that they, have money in or have a claim to somehow, you will know that people work a lot more than 40 hours a week. They will work many, many more hours than that to do what they can for their business and to help keep their business afloat and to make their business the best that it can be. So But 40 hours gets good, it doesn't let people abuse their workers, which is what FDR, I believe, was trying to accomplish with this act. But let's talk about the minimum wage. So you probably know, in current climate, that it is a debate that the minimum wage should be $15. Here's the issue with raising the minimum wage. I'm not saying that people don't deserve a living wage. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying you have to take economics into account. It would be foolish not to. If you raise the minimum wage, number one, if you raise the minimum wage and make it like a law that all businesses have to raise the minimum wage, lots and lots of businesses are going to go out of business. How many times can I say business? We're already seeing that in California, where they have forced the issue of raising the minimum wage, and more businesses are going under, and thus people are losing their jobs, and people are becoming homeless, and it's a massive issue. Because I don't know about you, but I'd rather have a job that doesn't pay me $15 an hour, but still pays me something so I can pay the bills, rather than have the government force the minimum wage to be raised, and the business that I was working for goes under because they can't afford to pay their workers, or they have to lay people off because they can't afford to pay all their workers the new minimum wage, and thus I have no job. Job paying less than $15, no job. Take the job paying less than 15 hours. Or paying less than $15 an hour. So, and then there's the other argument that there's the other fact that we will see inflation. The price of goods will rise if the minimum wage rises. Again, we're seeing that in states where they have risen the minimum wage. So $15 will eventually no longer be a living wage again, and we'll go through the whole debate all over again, and this will just keep going and going and going as prices get higher and higher and higher and higher. And more jobs are unavailable because more and more businesses have to close. So you need to think about that when you think about what the minimum wage should be. And I'm not saying either way. You're free to think how you think. And I'm not here to tell you how to think. I'm just here to bring facts, figures, and history to your attention so that you can see patterns and you can see facts. Because facts are facts. And facts are just the truth. Okay? And then in September 27th, 1938, FDR sends a private message to Britain, France, Germany, and Czechoslovakia, the leaders of those countries, not the countries themselves. That wouldn't be a very private message, would it? And in this message, FDR is urging that they all find a peaceful way to settle the issue over the Sudetenland. And if you don't know, the Sudetenland, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland to be part of Germany. And if you don't know what the Sudetenland is, it was the area around Germany that was filled with Germans, but was a part of the country Czechoslovakia. And I will have inserted a map in the slideshow further on down in the lesson, which will show you exactly what the Sudetenland looked like, because if you're anything like me, that's very vague, Sudetenland. It's not like an image doesn't directly just come to mind. Oh, I know what that looks like. Okay. So, then on September 30th, 1938, Britain, France, and Germany have the Munich Conference, in which the British Prime Minister Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister, I'm going to butcher this name, Daladier, agree to allow Germany to take the Sudetenland upon Hitler's agreement that Hitler would take nothing else, would not invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, would not invade any other countries, would just leave everything alone. And then Chamberlain goes home and everybody's like, yay! Everything's solved! Everything's great and wonderful and nothing's bad's gonna happen now. Obviously now we know that's not true, and Hitler's gonna invade Czechoslovakia. October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles' radio play War of the Worlds is aired. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail a little further on in the lesson. November 14th, 1938, the American ambassador to Germany, Hugh Wilson, is called back to the United States. And then a few days later, the German ambassador to the United States is also recalled. So that's just in November. Ambassadors are being called back to their home. Okay, on December 13th, 1938, the WPA announces that the number of Americans receiving federal relief has dropped to just over 2.1 million, down from the 3.2 million that it had been the previous year. January 5th, 1939, FDR formally submits his budget to Congress. His budget requested more than $1.3 billion for defense out of a total of $9 billion that he requested. February 27th, 1939, the Supreme Court declares that the sit-down strike, one of organized labor's most powerful tactics, is unconstitutional. So that type of strike, the sit-down strike, is deemed unconstitutional. March 15th, 1939, the German army invades Czechoslovakia. What did I tell you? All right. And then April 1st, 1939, the Spanish Civil War comes to an end. And the United States recognizes the government headed by General Francisco Franco. Well, he wasn't such a great guy because he's of the same cut from the same cloth as Hitler and Mussolini. He is a fascist. April 7th, 1939, Italy invades the small country of Albania. People are just going down. We're really starting to see things pick up as far as the start of World War II. If you heard it in my voice, I were kind of like quotations around that start. It was because there's two kind of starts to World War II. There's the unofficial start, but everyone kind of is like, oh my gosh. Even though I personally think that unofficial start should have been sooner than it's generally considered. But Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia is seen as the unofficial start of World War II. But the official start is when France and Britain declare war on Germany when he invades Poland, which is coming up. Okay, and then June 28th, 1939, the transatlantic passenger air services, so airplanes that go across the Atlantic, begins with a Pan-American Airways flight from Long Island, New York, to Lisbon, Portugal. And this trip is made in just under 24 hours in a 22 passengers. Okay, and we're going to go on to the next slide now. All right, FDR, again, the last part of FDR's second term is going to be more him seeing even more the writing on the wall, that this big conflict's coming, and that America's going to have to get involved, even though many people are still very isolationist, and they don't want any part in the war because they had a bad taste in their mouth. America as a whole, the American people, had a bad taste in their mouth after World War I. Okay, on July 1939, FDR is working really hard to try to do what he can to be able to support the Allies over in Europe, even without being very obvious about it. He is going to repeal the arms embargo, revise the neutrality law, and end the trade agreement with Japan because of Japan being hostile as well. On August 23rd, 1939, Germany and the USSR signed a non-agreement pact. This is like massive, and this really sparks fear for France and Great Britain. So remember, Europe as a whole had kind of had the Red Scare. It wasn't just, we talked about it in the American context when we had our first Red Scare. I say first because there's going to be another one that comes after World War II in the 1950s. But the first Red Scare, the one that we talked about, that wasn't just an American thing. Like, other countries around the world were kind of worried about communism. So the countries don't really like Russia. And Russia, they figured that Russia and Germany were gonna go at it. And seeing that Germany's like, no, Russia, it's all good. We're friends. Or not necessarily friends, but we're not gonna attack each other. That kind of sparks fear into the heart of France and Britain. September 1st, 1939, Germany launches a major invasion of Poland, starting the Second World War officially. Because on September 3rd, 1939, France and Britain declare war on Germany. And FDR declares U.S. neutrality in the war. On October 18th, 1939, FDR declares all American ports and waters closed to any submarines of any country that's involved in a war. So, belligerents. November 4th, 1939, FDR signs the Neutrality Act of 1939, repealing the general embargo on arms and allowing for the sale of arms to countries in war on a cash and carry basis. So that same basis that we had for any goods that a country at war wanted to get goods from the U.S., that you have to pay cash right away and you have to provide your own transportation. He's now allowing arms to be given the same way for countries that are in a war to get arms. And that was purely to support the Allies. November 30th, 1939, the USSR invades Finland. January 1940, the Allies take heavy losses in the Battle of the Atlantic. March 13th, 1940, Finland signs an armistice, or a treaty, with the USSR, giving away some of their land, and basically ending the Russo-Finnish War, which was a war within World War II, because that can happen. You can have a war within a war. Within a war. They're like little Russian nesting dolls. April 9th, 1940, the German army invades Norway and Denmark. And that's the start of the invasion, April 4th, but just April in general. The German army invades Norway and Denmark. May 1940, Germany invades Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And also the Prime Minister in Britain is no longer Chamberlain. It is now Winston Churchill. That's probably a name you're very familiar with if you've learned anything about World War II. I skipped one. May 25th, 1940, FDR establishes the Office for Emergency Management. Again, we're seeing that he's basically being like, hey, we're inevitably gonna be in this war, but I don't want to tell the people yet, really and truly, because they like me right now. May 26th, 1940, or May through June, May 26th is the official day, I think, that they hit France. But May through June of 1940, the German army sweeps across France and will end up taking all of France, including Paris. June 10th, 1940, at a speech at the University of Virginia, Roosevelt announces a change in the American stance in the war. America will no longer be neutral, but we will be non-belligerent. So basically, that means the United States will now openly support the Allies without actually going to war against the Axis. And that's actually generally pretty well received, except for a few people who know that really this is the start of our progressing towards actually going to war. June 20th, 1940, FDR appoints two prominent Republicans, Henry L. Stimson as Secretary of War, and Franklin Knox as Secretary of the Navy to his cabinet. Obviously, because they're Secretary of War and Secretary of Navy. But this was good on his part to kind of get those people in there, but also it was a show of unity to the voters and the world because an election was coming out. This is an election year, the election of 1940. And it's a pretty big, unprecedented election, and you'll see why in a second, unless you've already read ahead. June 28th, 1940, Congress passes the Alien Registration Act, which requires registration and fingerprinting of all people coming in, all immigrants coming in to the country. The bill also prohibits individuals or organizations from advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government by force. So no talking about overthrowing the U.S. government. Basically, Congress just trying to control the lives of Americans, especially immigrants. July 1940, political parties convene to nominate their choices for presidential candidate. The Republicans nominate Wendell L. Willkie for president and Senator Charles McNary of Oregon for vice president. And they're actually pretty popular. It's going to be a close call on the election of 1940, but that's not why it's so unprecedented. The Democrats nominate Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, for an unprecedented third term. July 1940, we see the Battle of Britain, the so-called Battle of Britain, begin with the very first bombing on the 10th of Britain by Germany. September 3rd, 1940, the United States trades 50 outdated destroyers to Britain in exchange for the right to construct air and naval bases on British holdings in the Western Hemisphere. So basically, Britain said, we want those outdated 50 destroyers, and the U.S. said, okay, but we want to build naval and air force bases on your holdings. And the Britons went, okay. September 16th, 1940, FDR signs the Selective Training and Service Act. It's the draft. He signs the draft in, and this is the first peacetime military draft in U.S. history, and requires all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for military training. November 5th, 1940, FDR wins a third term. So he's going to be our first president to have a third term, to run 3 terms in a row, breaking that unwritten rule that at the time it was unwritten, that had been established by George Washington of only 2 terms per president. And then January 6th, 1941, in his State of Union address, FDR stresses the need for support of the Allies as they defend the 4 essential freedoms. I'm using quote marks there. That's just what they're called. And those freedoms are the freedom of speech and expression. That's one, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. They go together. Freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those are the 4 essential freedoms. And that's going to be a massive, massive issue when it comes to World War II, and especially U.S. involvement in World War II. That's going to be kind of our motto once we get involved. Okay, so let's go on, and we're going to learn about the Hindenburg next. The Hindenburg disaster. So in Germany, in World War I specifically, Germany tried to use a fancy new aircraft, but the aircraft had been created before World War I, to bomb cities. They tried to use this aircraft to bomb cities, mostly Britain, and the craft was easy to spot, however, and not very fast, and once the British knew the best way to take down the craft, it was not hard to get the craft out of the sky. And we're talking about airships, also known as the rigid airship, or Zeppelins, although not all rigid airships are Zeppelins, but most people refer to rigid airships as Zeppelins. That's what they're known as. These large blimp-like structures, blimps are different. The rigid airships actually have a metal frame inside of them, whereas blimps do not. Blimps just are like inflatable. Rigid airships have a frame, a metal frame, that the fabric is over it, and the fabric is what allows it to float. So Zeppelins had promise as military aids due to their ability to stay in the air for several days and to travel great distances, although that it would take a while for any military to see them as useful, and then they wouldn't be used a whole lot. And even though other countries would pick up on the idea of them and try to make their own to use for military purposes, they never really caught on. And there's a reason for that. The rigid airship gets the name Zeppelin from the German man who created the craft, or the very first one at least, General Zeppelin. It took 4 tries to get a good working Zeppelin that could stay in the air for 24 hours or more. It took another 6 tries to get a really good airship that was remotely safe. The Zeppelin would not be used for the military, however, but for transportation of people. The airships had a tendency to burst into flames. Most of them met a fiery end. This was a large in part due to the use of hydrogen gas, which is a very flammable gas. Helium could be used to safely make a Zeppelin, but helium is not as abundant, as more expensive, and it's harder to come by. And Germany didn't really have any. So when they couldn't get things from the US, they had more easily on hand hydrogen gas. So that's what they used. Still, the German people continued to like the Zeppelins. They was a symbol of national pride for a while, and it was used as transportation for a good bit, with 1,500 passenger flights occurring before the Great War, World War I, occurred. Once World War I started, the military did see a good use for the airship in the war efforts. There are 2 different sides that are going to use the airship in the war. There's going to be the Navy and there's going to be the Army itself, and they're going to use the airship very differently. So the Navy is going to use the airship for reconnaissance or scouting. The airship can stay in the air for a long period of time, sometimes up to 3 days, and was just there. So it was useful for scouting too. That was the Navy's use of it. The Army's use of it was going to be used to drop bombs, but the aircraft is slow. The most it ever gets up to is 80 miles per hour, but that's later with the Hindenburg, not these aircrafts that were being used during World War I. So they're easy to spot, they're easy to see, and they're slow, so they're not able to really get away from the airplanes that would come to shoot them down. And then they didn't have great accuracy with their bombs. It was just kind of like just throwing a bomb. Like if you're up in the air and you just throw a bomb down at the ground, you got no guarantee that it's going to hit something or kill anybody. 557 people were killed by air raids made by the Germans, which may seem like a lot, but it ends up being 1 person for every 10 bombs that were dropped. So not as much. Once the British caught on to the air raids and figured out that the Zeppelins were highly flammable, they made a special incendiary round, and that was pretty much it for Zeppelins as bombing aircrafts, because 1 hit from that incendiary round and bye-bye Zeppelin. Fiery ball of flame. When Germany lost World War I, the Treaty of Versailles banned the creation of any airships, any Zeppelins whatsoever. However, the restriction was lifted in 1926, and the world then entered the golden age of the airship, which didn't last for very long, but, Zeppelins were able to offer transportation across the Atlantic before airplanes, and 1 Zeppelin even made it around the world. Zeppelins were luxury, especially the Hindenburg. It was extremely luxury. I'm going to play a clip and let it be described to you. The Zeppelins were now reaching speeds of 80 to 85 miles per hour. So the Hindenburg was like the most glorious Zeppelin, but it was also the one that ended Zeppelin, the airship, the age of the airship that ended airship traffic, that ended pretty much anything. So the Hindenburg was a German airship, a German Zeppelin, that had been funded by the German government, Hitler, as a means of public transportation on the agreement that the airship would be used as propaganda for the Nazi government. The Nazi symbol, the swastika, was displayed on the fins of the aircraft, which you probably saw if you were looking closely at the picture on the last slide. Okay, and we're going to hear a description of what the Hindenburg was like.
The Hindenburg was finally ready by 1936 and was 804 feet long, had cabins for 50 passengers, a crew of 40, and could carry 22,000 pounds of mail and cargo. It used 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas, had a top speed of 85 miles per hour, and a range in excess of 8,000 miles. Though the passenger cabins on board the ship were cramped, it did have large public rooms, as well as a dining room, a bar, a lounge, a writing room, and a pressurized smoking room. Throughout, it was opulently decorated with stylish design features. It was most definitely aimed at the privileged and powerful in society, offering only a first-class service. The cost of a one-way transatlantic ticket was $400, about $7,145 in today's value.
So you can see it was very much a way of travel for the elite, for the upper class. It's often called the Titanic of the sky. The Hindenburg was flying from Germany to New Jersey. When she got to New Jersey and she came into land to dock in New Jersey, after a relatively normal flight, she somehow exploded. There are many theories as to why she exploded. There's the static theory, which is very complicated and requires everything to be just so. There's the theory of lightning striking her, even though no one saw lightning strike her. There's the theory of sabotage due to the political climate in the world at the time. There's the theory that one of the engines was malfunctioning and sending sparks, which caused the the hydrogen to explode. Although this one is pretty much discounted because the sparks wouldn't have been hot enough to have actually made the hydrogen gas explode. There was a leak in the hull that had been causing hydrogen gas to escape. One of the engines had been leaking fuel. Like there were a lot of different theories as to why the airship exploded, but no one knows for certain. There were 96 people on board, and out of those 96 people, only 35 were killed. A lot of them were killed in the fire, but a few did die when they tried to jump out of the ship because of the fire. One person did die, one of the ground people that was there to kind of like bring the Hindenburg to ground. One of them did die as well. So the total loss of life due to the disaster was 36. And this information is on the next slide, but there is audio on the next slide that is historical radio audio live from the person who was a reporter who was at the scene, and I wanted to let that play on the next slide. You can also see a picture of the disaster when it occurred on the next slide. Once the fire started, it took less than a minute for the airship to be almost completely engulfed in flames and to hit the ground. So she's called the Titanic of the sky, let's compare her to the Titanic. The Titanic took several hours, whereas the Hindenburg just took a few minutes. And the audio that you're going to hear on the other slide of that reporter, it's very famous audio from the disaster. And that's the history of airships, and specifically the Hindenburg disaster, which kind of ended the age of airships.
Ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... The person in the flank, get the Charlie. It's fighting, and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's running and bursting in the flames and it's falling on the mooring path, and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's the space is running. oh, 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the fans are just screaming around it. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, The War of the Worlds radio play. So The War of the Worlds is a novel written by H.G. Wells and tells the story of invaders from Mars that have come to attack Earth and are attacking the city of London in England. Orson Welles, no relation to H.G. Wells, was a 1900s actor. On October 30th, 1939, Orson Welles and the theater company did a new redone version of the War of the Worlds novel that put the story in modern day, for the time, New Jersey. And it set the story in real time with fake news broadcasts and eyewitness reports. There are two sides of what occurred due to this radio. So if you don't know, there's a widely held story that this radio play caused terror across the nation and mass hysteria and panic because people thought that the dramatization of the story was actually happening, was real. It was too believable. That has been what has been taught in schools and what's widely been believed by a lot of people for many years. Well, there's a newer other side that says the show wasn't very popular, people weren't really listening to the show, and that no one believed, the people that were listening knew that it was a dramatization, a radio play, as you would have it, and there was no way, not enough people were listening, so there was no way that there could have been a nationwide panic. The reporters reporting that there was a nationwide panic, they were reporting that due to the fact that they were salty. They didn't like the new form of media, the radio. They didn't like that people were so fascinated by the radio and wanted it. And they were worried that the newspapers were dying out. So that's kind of why supposedly the newspapers were reporting on it when it wasn't real. I have heard, I talked to actually people who were around. They were young, but they were around when it was broadcast. There was another radio show occurring during the broadcast, and they were on a competing radio station. And that radio production, that on that other competing radio station, was much more popular than the one that was being played from the War of the Worlds. So more people were listening to that. But there's also, so the two people that I talked to, one lived in the city, and they knew that it was not real if they were listening to it for the most part, apparently. And it didn't cause mass panic in the cities, but in the countryside, people did think it was real, and they were a lot more prone to thinking it was real because they didn't have access to things like people did in the cities. So in the cities, people had more access to things such as telephones. A lot of people had telephones and were able to call in if they were concerned. You call into an operator known as a switchboard operator, and they would be either able to get you connected to someone in, like in law enforcement or hospital staff, or they'd be able to answer your questions. In this case, like, oh my God, are there Martians attacking New Jersey? No, there are no Martians attacking New Jersey. So there was not, it doesn't seem like that much panic in the cities, but in the rural areas where they didn't really have that, maybe we did see some of the panic. People did think it was real because all they had was the radio to really get news, and the way that the radio show presented itself seemed very newsy. I mean, because it presents itself with fake news broadcasts. And you're going to listen to some of the radio show on the next slide. But regardless of whether or not the radio show caused a mass panic, it was still very important because it was a new way of telling a story over the radio. It was a new way of performance. This, making it seem, setting it in modern day, making it seem very realistic. That was new and exciting. So on the next slide, you're going to listen to some of the radio show.
That in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space. Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. In the 39th year of the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. Near the end of October, business was better. The war scare was over. More men were back at work. Sales were picking up. On this particular evening, October 30th, the Crosley service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radios.
The next 24 hours, not much change in temperature. A slight atmospheric disturbance of undetermined origin is reported over Nova Scotia, causing a low-pressure area to move down rather rapidly over the northeastern states, bringing a forecast of rain accompanied by winds of light gale force. Maximum temperature 66, minimum 48. This weather report comes to you from the Government Weather Bureau. We take you now to the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York, where you will be entertained by the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From the Meridian Room in the Park Plaza Hotel in New York City, we bring you the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra. With a touch of the Spanish, Raymond Raquello leads off with La Comparsita.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Raymond Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
And now a tune that never loses favor, the ever-popular Stardust, Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
Ladies and gentlemen, following on the news given in our bulletin a moment ago, the Government Meteorological Bureau has requested the large observatories of the country to keep an astronomical watch on any further disturbances occurring on the planet Mars. Due to the unusual nature of this occurrence, we have arranged an interview with the noted astronomer, Professor Pearson, who will give us his views on this event. In a few moments, we will take you to the Princeton Observatory at Princeton, New Jersey. We return you until then to the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra. ready now to take you to the Princeton Observatory at Princeton, where Carl Phillips, our commentator, will interview Professor Richard Pearson, famous astronomer. We take you now to Princeton, New Jersey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Carl Phillips speaking to you from the observatory at Princeton. I'm standing in a large semicircular room, pitch black except for an oblong split in the ceiling. Through this opening, I can see a sprinkling of stars that cast a kind of frosty glow over the intricate mechanism of the huge telescope. The ticking sound you hear is the vibration of the clockwork. Professor Pearson stands directly above me on a small platform, peering through the giant lens. I'll ask you to be patient, ladies and gentlemen, during any delay that may arise during our interview. Besides the ceaseless watch of the heavens, Professor Pearson may be interrupted by telephone or other communications. During this period, he is in constant touch with the astronomical centers of the world. Professor, may I begin our questions?
Any time, Mr. Phillips.
Professor, would you please tell our radio audience exactly what you see as you observe the planet Mars through your telescope?
Nothing unusual at the moment, Mr. Phillips. A red disk swimming in the blue sea. Transverse stripes across the disk. Quite distinct now because Mars happens to be at the point nearest the Earth, in opposition, as we call it.
In your opinion, what do these transverse stripes signify, Professor Pearson?
Not canals, I can assure you, Mr. Phillips.
They...
Although that's the popular conjecture of those who imagine Mars to be inhabited. From a scientific viewpoint, the stripes are merely the result of atmospheric conditions peculiar to the planet.
Then you're quite convinced, as a scientist, that living intelligence as we know it does not exist on Mars?
I say the chances against it are 1,000 to 1.
And yet, how do you account for these gas eruptions occurring on the surface of the planet at regular intervals?
Phillips, I cannot account for it.
By the way, Professor, for the benefit of our listeners, how far is Mars from the Earth?
Approximately 40 million miles.
Well, that seems a safe enough distance. Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Someone has just handed Professor Pearson a message. While he reads it, let me remind you that we are speaking to you from the observatory in Princeton, New Jersey, where we are interviewing the world-famous astronomer, Professor Pearson. One moment, please. Professor Pearson has passed me a message which he has just received. Professor, may I read the message to the listening audience?
Certainly, Mr. Phillips.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall read you a wire addressed to Professor Pearson from Dr. Gray of the Natural History Museum, New York. Quote, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed, Lloyd Gray, Chief of Astronomical Division. Unquote. Professor Pearson, could this occurrence possibly have something to do with the disturbances observed on the planet Mars?
Hardly, Mr. Phillips. This is probably a meteorite of unusual size, and its arrival at this particular time is merely a coincidence. However, we shall conduct a search as soon as daylight permits.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 10 minutes, we've been speaking to you from the observatory at Princeton, bringing you a special interview with Professor Pearson, noted astronomer. This is Carl Phillips speaking. We are returning you now to our New York studio.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the latest bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. Toronto, Canada. Professor Morse of Macmillan University reports observing a total of 3 explosions on the planet Mars between the hours of 7:45 p.m. and 9:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This confirms earlier reports received from American observatories. Now, nearer home, comes a special bulletin from Trenton, New Jersey. It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. The flash in the sky was visible within a radius of several hundred miles, and the noise of the impact was heard as far north as Elizabeth. We have dispatched a special mobile unit to the scene, and we'll have our commentator, Carl Phillips, give you a word picture of the scene as soon as he can reach there from Princeton. In the meantime, we take you to the Hotel Martinet in Brooklyn, where Bobby Millett and his orchestra are offering a program of dance music. We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen.
All right, some World War II basics. There are two sides to World War II. They're the Allies and the Axis. Axes. You see it on screen. The Allies were France, Britain, and of course later the US. And the Axes were Germany, Italy, and Japan. I think Japan joined a little bit later. More and more countries in Europe, and also just not necessarily Europe, because I personally think that Horatio, the person over Japan, was kind of, he was totalitarian, but I also think he was kind of fascist. But more and more countries in Europe are being controlled by a totalitarian regime. If you don't know what that means, it means one person in total control over the country. So you've got a communist in control of Russia, also the USSR. That's Joseph Stalin, who's going to actually kill more people than Hitler, fun fact, because he gets rid of anyone who he thinks opposes him. Then you've got the fascist Mussolini in Italy, and then you've got the fascist Adolf Hitler in Germany. And actually, Mussolini is the one who invented fascism, by the way, just in case you were curious. And then you've got Horatio in Japan. I know I'm butchering that, I'm sorry. And then you've got a fascist Francisco Franco, who's going to have control of Spain after the Spanish Civil War. And we're going to see a series of events happen that are going to lead us into the war. And remember that these totalitarian regimes were able to set up due to the state of affairs in the world at the time, with the Great Depression and weak leadership, which was prominent in several of these countries, and just not great living conditions and people being unhappy in general. So massive invasions that kind of happen. I use kind of quotes there, even though technically these are invasions, but that happened before the official start of World War II. You've got in 1933 the start of the Spanish Civil War. The League of Nations, France and Britain aren't going to do anything about the Spanish Civil War. They're not going to offer their help to the Spanish established government at the time. They're not going to do anything. But Italy and Germany are going to see this as an opportunity to establish more fascist leaders in more countries around the world. So they're going to support the Civil War. And they're also going to use the Civil War as training grounds for basically getting their military prepared for what's going to come with World War II. And the Spanish Civil War is a real taste of what World War II, the fighting in World War II, is going to look like. And the devastation from the Spanish Civil War is depicted very well in Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica, which is going to be on the last slide of this lesson. And then in 1935, Italy goes after Ethiopia. The League of Nations does nothing about Italy going after Ethiopia, except kind of reprimand them a little bit and be like, you shouldn't have done that. But that's the extent of what the League of Nations does. And Hitler takes notice of that. And then in 1937, Japan's going to invade China. The League of Nations is again going to do nothing about that. And again, Hitler's noticing. So with Hitler noticing this, it's going to make him curious as to what he can get away with. So Hitler starts testing the waters to see what he can get away with. And in 1936, he marches into the Rhineland. So that's the first thing that he took back for Germany. And then in 1938, Hitler marches into Austria and takes it for Germany, unopposed, really. And then still in 1938, Hitler starts demanding the Sudetenland. And there's a map there on the screen. That, reddish part. Okay, so the yellow is what has been claimed as Germany, although that little yellow thing down near Italy, that was once Austria. But that reddish, purplish part is the Sudetenland that Hitler is demanding. The Allies were starting to get nervous in response to Hitler, and so they hold the Munich Conference, in which the Allies, led by British Prime Minister Chamberlain, agree to give Hitler the Sudetenland on his agreement that he would take nothing else. He would invade nowhere else. He would do nothing else. This would be it. And Hitler agrees, and he signs the agreement, and everything's great and wonderful. Chamberlain goes back to Britain, and Hitler turns around and invades Czechoslovakia, as you can see marked on that map. Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia is seen as mini by the unofficial start of World War II, but the war doesn't officially start until Hitler invades Poland, and then the Allies will declare a war on Germany. World War II 1939 timeline. So these are all events that are happening in 1939. So March 15th, Czechoslovakia surrenders to Adolf Hitler. August 31st, Germany's Adolf Hitler signs the order for an assault on Poland. After the Germans stage a phony raid on a radio station, they blame the Polish for the unprovoked attack. September 1st, without declaring war, Germany invades Poland. The coordinated air and land attack is conducted with such brutal efficiency that Blitzkrieg, I'm butchering that, becomes a feared offensive tactic. And that's going to be the offensive tactic of the German army. September 3rd, honoring their treaty with Poland, France and Great Britain enter the war against Germany, and thus this is the official start of the war. September 4th, Japan, engaged in war with China, declares its neutrality in the European war for now. September 5th, as war broke out in Europe, American settlement heavily favored isolationism, staying out of the war. With the nation still skeptical of Allied propaganda after it had lured the U.S. into the First World War, the United States declares its neutrality in the European war. September 10th, Canada declares war on Germany. September 27th, Warsaw, Poland surrenders to German forces. And Poland is split by Germany and Russia because in the treaty, the non-aggression treaty that Germany and Russia signed, they agreed to split Poland, and Russia actually came in and helped Germany attack Poland a few days before Poland surrenders. October 16th, in the first attack on British territory, the Germans hit the Brits at the 5th of the 4th. They damaged cruisers Southampton and Edinburgh and destroy the Mohawk. November 14th, the Soviet Union is expelled from the League of Nations for its aggression against Finland, because remember we talked about earlier that the USSR attacks Finland. December 2nd, the 1940 Olympic Games to be held in Finland are canceled. So that's kind of a rough timeline of what was going on as far as the war goes in 1939. So we'll look further into the war next week. I'm going to go ahead and go to this last slide so that you can look at that painting. And like I said, that's Pablo Picasso's painting of his hometown that was affected so badly by the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. Now, I'm not going to ask you to write a narration or anything of this painting, because obviously it is not an American painter. It is not an American painting. It is a Spanish painter who is painting a Spanish painting about a Spanish place. But I do think it's important to see it, and kind of, especially with the context of knowing what it's about and kind of seeing, it's a powerful painting when you know what it's about. I will be sending a homework email, if I haven't already done it, here shortly. That email should have the study guide attached and the test. Take your time, but please remember that I do need other homework. I need the other tests that I sent out. I need that homework to get to me as quickly as possible. We only have 3 other weeks left before school is done, and if I don't have work, you're going to have incomplete grades. And I know y'all don't want that, and I don't want that. So do your best to get me that homework any way possible. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or text me if you sent me an email and I haven't responded. Sometimes emails do go to my spam. And I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. And if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments or send me an email. And I would love if you put in the comments something that really stands out to you about this painting. Just to tell me. Like, it's not a narration, so like you don't have to form your answer really study it, but like just look at the painting and see something that really stands out to you, that kind of shows you what you think the devastation that small town of Spain felt. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next week. Bye!